Jó napot kívánok! Sok-sok szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit a képernyőkön innen és túl. A szólásszabadság a mai beszélgetésünknek, a mai panelünknek a témája, de még mielőtt belevágnánk, egy pár szót szólnék én is arról, hogy miként látom a szólásszabadság helyzetét itt a nyugati térfélen, Európában és ezen belül Magyarországon. Hogyha a szólásszabadság kérdéskörét beszéljük, akkor szerintem ezt nem lehet manapság a közösségi médiának az erejétől elfüggetleníteni. Úgy lehet szerintem szólásszabadságról beszélni, hogyha arról a platformról beszélünk, ahol a legtöbb ember ma ki szeretné fejezni önmagát. Egy érdekes számmal kezdeném a mai beszélgetést. Ez egy nem is olyan régi századvéges kutatás. Azt kérdezték meg a válaszadóktól, hogy ha csak egyetlen egy forrást jelölhetnek meg, akkor mi az, amit ők közéleti politikai szempontból a leghitelesebb hírforrásnak tartanak. És a magyaroknak a 62%-a mondta azt, hogy az internet, és csupán a 27%-a mondta azt, hogy a televízió. Ez azért érdekes, mert 10 évvel ezelőtt ez pont a fordítottja volt, ma pedig tulajdonképpen minden áttevődött már a digitális térbe. Úgyhogy a szólásszabadság legfontosabb kérdése tulajdonképpen az, hogy szabadok vagyunk-e a közösségi médiában, szabadunk vagyunk-e a Facebookon, a TikTokon, a YouTube-on kifejezni önmagunkat, és ezzel tudunk-e sikert elérni. Így hangzik ez a kérdés, és az elmúlt években sajnos olyan hírek jöttek velünk szembe, amelyek nem túl bíztatóak e tekintetben. Nemrég kikerültek az Egyesült Államokban a Twitter aktáként elhíresült belső kommunikációs levelek, amelyből kiderült, hogy a Twitter szándékosan az elmúlt amerikai Egyesült Államokbeli választásokon a demokrata jelölt fiának a botrányos ügyét, azt szándékosan letekerték. Az erről szóló New York Post cikkeket törölték, letekerték az elérését, de ez nem az egyetlen példa. Tulajdonképpen a Facebookon áll is egy egészen komoly kiterjedt fact-checker, azaz tényellenőrző gárda szabja azt meg, hogy milyen információ terjedhet szabadon és mely nem. Ezt ráadásul azután állították fel, miután 2016-ban Trump megnyerte az amerikai elnökválasztást. Akkor a baloldal azt a narratívát kezdte el építeni, hogy a közösségi médiának köszönhetően, sőt, pontosabban a közösségi médián terjedő álhíreknek köszönhetően nyerhette meg Trump a választást, és természetesen az összes jobboldali politikai véleményt az álhír kategóriába próbálták belepréselni, és ennek az apropóján ma is sajnos itt Magyarországon is megeshet, hogy egy jobboldali vélemény mellé, hát jobb esetben egy kiigazítás érkezik, rosszabb esetben pedig oldaltiltásról beszélhetünk. És akkor sem védett az ember, hogyha amúgy magas politikai tisztséget tölt be, hogyha az Egyesült Államok elnökét el tudták távolítani ezekről a platformokról, akkor ki lehet biztonságban. Persze feltevődik a kérdés, hogy egy ilyen helyzetben mit évők legyünk. Mit évők legyünk, van egy pár opció, ne használjunk közösségi médiát, hozzunk létre saját platformokat, vagy esetleg avatkozzon be, vagy európai szinten, vagy hazai szinten a kormány ezekbe a folyamatokba, és védje meg az állampolgároknak a szólásszabadsághoz való jogát. Most az összes opció az összes opció érdekes, és a beszélgetésünk az pont erről fog szólni, de elmondanám előre, hogy melyik az, amiben én leginkább hiszek. Ez egy nagyon komoly vita volt pár évvel ezelőtt, amikor még digitális igazgatója voltam a Fidesznek, hogy milyen irányba menjünk, hogyan döntsünk, maradjunk vagy nem maradjunk a közösségi médiában. És akkor ezeket a számokat is ismerve úgy döntöttünk, hogy nincs más választás. Amikor a magyarok úgy döntöttek, hogy egymással ezeken az eszközökön keresztül szeretnének kommunikálni, amikor a napi kapcsolattartás, a barátkozás, ismerkedés, programszervezés és többek között amúgy persze a politikai véleményformálás is ebben a digitális térben történik, akkor egyetlen hozzáállás lehet az, amit mi vallunk, mégpedig az, hogy nekünk itt maradnunk kell, harcolnunk kell és ügyesnek kell lennünk. Persze az összes kihívás közül nem az egyetlen a liberális moderátoroknak a beavatkozása. Vannak ezen kívül más kihívások is, de szerencsére ezek kiismerhetőek. Például az, hogy hogyan működnek az algoritmusok, mennyire vagyunk képesek eljutni emberekhez, de a jó hír ezzel kapcsolatban az, hogy az algoritmusok kiismerhetőek, és hogyha valaki beletesz abba egy csomó időt, energiát, erőfeszítést, hogy kiismerje ezeknek az új platformoknak a működését, akkor véleményem szerint a közösségi médiában nem csak veszély van, hanem lehetőség is. Lehetőség, amit a jobb oldal amúgy megragadott az előző választási ciklus előtt, megragadták a Fidesznek a politikusai, de megragadták azok a remek jobboldali kezdeményezések is, mint amilyen például a Megafon, amely azt a célt tűzte ki maga elé, hogy a jobboldaliak hallgatását meg fogja törni, jól elkészített tartalmakkal, hálózatba szervezett működéssel, véleményvezérekkel meg fogják törni ezt a hallgatást, és ez látszólag sikerült is egyelőre. De az a helyzet, hogy ez a tér ez nagyon gyakran változik. És hogyha mi a mi szólásszabadságunkért ki szeretnénk állni, és azt meg szeretnénk védeni, arra két módot kell válasszunk. Az egyik az az, hogy érjük el minden áron azt, hogy a szabadságunk megmaradjon ezeken a platformokon is. A másik pedig az az, hogy tanuljuk ki ezeknek a működését olyan mértékben, hogy mindig egy lépéssel előtte legyünk a versenytársainknak. És hogyha ez megtörténik, akkor hirtelen nem veszély lesz ez számunkra, hanem lehetőség, és ennek az apropóján, ha megengedik nekem, akkor váltanék is angol nyelvre, és hadd mutassam be önöknek a mai beszélgetésnek a szereplőit. So, please welcome Eva from the Holland, who is a political commentator and a legal philosophist. Thank you very much. Please welcome Tim Constantine from the United States, who is a writer at the Washington Times and is a host of the Capitol Hill show. And please welcome Josh Hammer, also from the United States, who is a host of the Josh Hammer show. Sorry. Right, so my very first question to you is, what do you think the state of free speech is in the Western world? How would you rate it? Are we in a good place, a bad place, and what are the main obstacles if we're not in a good place? And please feel free to answer in any order. I'm curious about all of your answers.
Okay, so thank you for the question. Great to be back here in Budapest. I was here for the first time last year. Really beautiful city, really wonderful to be back here. Very grateful for the invitation. Look, I think the state of free speech in the West is very bad. I mean, I hate to be kind of so pessimistic and black pill, but there's no point in not stating the obvious or beating around the bush either. I mean, I think what you see, certainly in my country, the United States, what you certainly see in most countries of Europe, especially those who have fallen more under the hegemonic sway of the European Union, is uniparty regime-controlled media. And we increasingly in the United States, we have a First Amendment in our US Constitution, but increasingly the left is ignoring that. And, you know, under the kind of false advertising and labeling of so-called misinformation, and this horrific collusion between the federal government and the administrative state and the big tech platforms, you see the censoring of speech, the likes of which we have not seen in a very, very long time. So you basically have regime-controlled media and then dissident media, and that's at least the way that I see them.
I would respectfully disagree with that. I think if you have never traveled the world and only spent time in the United States, it may not be as open or as free or as seemingly open as it was years ago. However, compared to much of the world, it is still amazing. And sometimes you have to shake things out over time. You have to actually let things settle, and there will be an ebb and a flow to it. And so, I mean, you're right in that the left-wing media dominates in certain areas, but Josh is in talk radio, I'm in talk radio, and the right clearly dominates talk radio. There is a demand in the United States for that. No one censors that. When you look at broadcast news in the United States, Fox News far and wide is more popular than any other, and it leans to the right. The left-wing media outlets don't come anywhere close in the ratings. And so there is some frustrating things that go on right now, whether that's in social media or elsewhere. But anywhere where the measure is by demand, then in the United States there is a balance. There's an offering from the left, there's an offering from the right, and what has been clear in most media is that the right has dominated in where it is on demand.
What's the situation in Europe?
Well, that's what I wanted to say. I think we definitely do not have a balance when it comes to the European political landscape, in media especially. When you look at my country in the Netherlands, for example, there is barely any conservative media. And if there is, then the government makes sure that they come down on them as hard as they possibly can. And that is something that we see in the entire European Union with, for example, the Digital Service Act. And basically, any type of opinion that goes against the mainstream narrative or that is deemed to be dissident opinion is now labeled as misinformation or disinformation. And the fact that it might not be as bad in the West as it could be in other countries, in a sense, I think might even be a disadvantage to us because we have a sort of idea left of free speech, but in reality, if you go against the state's narrative, for example, we are not far removed from being labeled enemies of the state, and especially during COVID. We saw that happen in all of our countries, yet we still like to say that we have freedom of speech, but, well, I wonder how long that lasts, and we sure as hell don't have a First Amendment, and sure as hell also don't have a Second Amendment, for that matter. So I don't see the future of freedom of speech in a very positive light, to be honest with you.
Go ahead.
It's interesting how people at either end of the spectrum sometimes think they are being ignored. The people on the far left at times think they are being ignored as well. And I'll give you an example. The night before Donald Trump was inaugurated as President of the United States, I was in Washington with my son, and we were going to a number of parties to celebrate the incoming presidency of Donald Trump. And we would walk from place to place. There were protests, there were cheers, there were celebratory meetings, but there was a woman standing alone in the center of the city of Washington holding a sign that said, F Trump. And she was standing holding this up. And so I walked up to her and I said, look, I work in talk radio. I would love to understand, he hasn't even been sworn in yet as president. Why are you saying this obscenity about the incoming president? And her first reaction was, you're probably just a Trump supporter. I don't want to talk to you. I said, no, it's not about what I think. I really genuinely want to hear what you think. And I am going to use this on radio, but I want to hear what you think. And she said, it's all about oppression. The oppression here is unbelievable. And I asked her, have you ever been outside of the United States? And she said, no. But it doesn't matter. Oppression is oppression. And I thought, she's standing in the Capitol of the United States of America, holding up a sign that is against the incoming president with an obscenity, but she thinks that she's being oppressed. And so I think we need to be very careful on our side. There are things that are very frustrating, and we want to work to overcome. But we don't want to be that woman. We don't want to be convinced that it's an unbridgeable, unattainable goal. We're not going to fade away. Free speech is, there's an ebb and a flow. And it's not going to fade away because there are enough people like you and like us that are going to fight, and that flow will come back. We may be in an ebb right now, but it's not going to go away.
And but there is some sort of agreement between all three of you that, on different degrees, that there is some sort of problem. I'm curious about what can we do about it. Some people say that right-wing people should just simply make their own platforms like Rumble for video or Getter instead of Twitter. What's your take on that? Will that approach work?
Look, so I kind of alluded to this in my last answer, but what I see playing out, and I could speak most particularly to what's happening in the United States, is an unprecedented collusion between the public sphere and the purportedly private sphere, and really the collapse of any meaningful distinction between kind of the government and the so-called private sector. And the big tech oligarchs, the titans of industry in Silicon Valley, I think are kind of the prime example of this. I mean, speaking of suppression of speech, I think that you could probably argue that it was forced government, private sector, collusive suppression and censorship of speech that actually cost Donald Trump the 2020 election. Why do I say that? Because if you look at the actual total that President Trump lost in the 4 to 5 states that mattered for the Electoral College margin, it was roughly 40 to 45 million votes. And if you then go state by state and you look at the percentage of people who told pollsters that if they had heard of the Hunter Biden laptop story, which, as many people here know, Facebook and Twitter worked actively with the federal government, the FBI, and the deep state to censor that, a large enough percentage of voters told pollsters that if they knew about that, they would have actually changed their vote that the math actually works out that it's quite possible that suppression of speech and this public-private collusion via the big tech oligarchs literally cost President Trump a second term. Now, as far as the remedies go, in a U.S. context, I've written and spoken about this at great length. We have a particular statute from 1996 when it comes to the big tech platforms called Section 230, which basically gives our tech platforms extra legal immunity to basically take whatever content down they want for whatever reason whatsoever. I have argued in favor of using the law to tie that immunity to a First Amendment standard. Put another way, if the government cannot censor you for what you would say on a public sidewalk, they should not be able to censor you on a quote-unquote private platform, which we now know is not very private. They're working with the federal government anyway. I have also argued in favor of more aggressive antitrust enforcement, which kind of goes at odds with much of kind of conservatism Inc. doctrine, but I think it's well past time for conservatives to try to realize what is going on with a distinctly corporate tyranny that we have here in the 21st century and rise to the challenge and start busting up some of these horrifically woke actors that are doing immeasurable social harm and civilizational destruction. And then finally, I've also argued in favor of common carrier regulation, which is an old English common law concept that would basically regulate them the same way that in the United States, for example, we regulate the telephone companies and your internet providers as well.
But if you do that, where do you break off friends? I mean, how do you even break off Facebook into, for example, 6 different companies if you were to do that?
So look, I mean, Meta is a great example. I mean, Meta has acquired over the years Instagram, WhatsApp, Spotify. I mean, Meta has immeasurable companies at this point, right? So I mean, there's no compelling reason whatsoever why Meta should necessarily have been able to legitimately acquire WhatsApp or Spotify. I mean, take Google, for example. Google's market share when it comes to their search in particular, in the United States at least, is north of 90%. Their market share for digital advertising in particular, I don't have the exact number, but I think it's 70 to 80% roughly. I mean, they are a total, complete monopolist, these companies. Amazon too, to a lesser extent.
What's your take, Tim?
This is true even in traditional media, in the old-fashioned television and radio, because it used to be, American law was, no one entity could own more than 2 FM stations and 1 AM station in any one market. And that was intentionally done so that no one dominated the message in that market. That has all been changed. You can now own 6 FM and 4 AM if you're in New York, or if you're in Boston, or if you're in Washington, which means these large conglomerates have essentially bought up the radio and television, the broadcasting rights in every town. You have 2 or 3 ownerships in every big city, and if those 2 or 3 ownerships happen to lean to the left, then the message that is delivered all is to the left. So if you go backwards in law to the old days where it was 2 and 1 instead of 6 and 4, you would have any number of different companies, any number of different approaches to how to deliver media. And I mean, there used to be laws that required a certain amount of broadcast time be spent in information. You had to, even if you were a music entity, you had to present news and other aspects somewhere in your broadcast day. And that's all gone away. So I think the softening has lent itself to a monopoly-type situation where you've got very few people delivering a message in broadcast. And I think you're right. That same thing is happening when they buy up Instagram, when they buy up all these entities, and all of a sudden it is one group deciding what message is heard from several platforms.
Right. If I understand correctly, Josh, you're arguing for some sort of, structure-based intervention from the government in order to ensure that free speech is enforced. But here in Europe, we know very well what government intervention looks like. Would that actually help, or would that hinder the process? What do you think, Eva?
I would like the government to stay out of my business as much as possible, and especially when it comes to the media and, well, when it comes to freedom of speech. I would say that here in Europe, the fact that most of our countries don't have an equivalent of the First Amendment is one of our biggest problems. In my country, you can be quite literally criminally prosecuted for even offending certain minority groups. And if you look at me and think, oh, does that ever happen? Well, yes, it does happen. It actually also happens to politicians like Geert Wilders, who have been convicted for those crimes, quote unquote. And that is just a trend that we see everywhere. So this is something that is going to affect all of us. And like I said, misinformation is just a cover-up term for anything I don't agree with. And that is something that is incredibly dangerous for all of us. You know, at first they say that you're a victim of misinformation. Then after that, you are maybe someone who spreads misinformation, then it already starts to get very, very dangerous. And what if you make it up, quote unquote? Well, like I said, we have seen already that they're working on legislation that could potentially label you an enemy of the state or an enemy of democracy. If you are undermining democracy with misinformation just because you go against what the mainstream narrative is, then what is free speech even, right? So I am worried about that. I don't want the government to regulate any of that. I think we need deregulation rather than regulation.
I mentioned earlier how in the United States, talk radio is dominated by conservatives. And there have been attempts to put together national radio programs from the left, and they inevitably fail. There is not the same demand as there is for information from the right. And that's a free market. That is free speech. And maybe 5 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, Democrats in the United States Congress were clamoring for a law that would require some sort of balance. Rather than having a free market determine what people want to hear, they wanted to determine that some of the content would be from the left and some of the content would be from the right. And you and I both know then who's going to determine what information falls into each category. And if the government gets involved there, then essentially the government is determining what you're going to listen to on a day-to-day basis. So I think I'm in complete agreement with you. I don't want the government getting involved and trying to tell me what I can broadcast on a day-to-day basis, or Josh what he can broadcast on a day-to-day basis, or what our syndicated outlets can broadcast on a day-to-day basis. I think making sure the government stays as far away from that and let the people decide what they want to listen to. Because truthfully, if they don't like my content, I'm not going to still be on the radio.
Josh?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that this notion that those of us on kind of the more nationalist and populist elements of the right that are calling for more government intervention to restore the status quo of regime media versus dissident media, we're actually just trying to restore a culture of free speech that has been swatted down and greatly diminished due to decades-long collusion between the public sector and the private sector. So I can go step by step here. So when I mentioned common carrier regulation earlier, all common carrier regulation for the big tech platforms would mean that the social media platforms, Google search, they cannot discriminate based on your Twitter algorithms or on your Google search algorithms based on your political viewpoints, your religious ideology, or discriminate based on anything that other US laws such as the First Amendment would prohibit you from discriminating on. When it comes to antitrust enforcement, the entire purpose of antitrust enforcement and ideally kind of spinning off Amazon, Google, and Meta into smaller companies would be to restore a culture of free speech. Similarly, when it comes to what I mentioned, our somewhat unique law known as Section 230, what I said is that we should actually tie this extra legal immunity provision that Congress gave the tech platforms to a First Amendment standard, which is just meaning that we should make it so that whatever you say in social media cannot be censored if it could otherwise not be censored if it was said in a public sidewalk. So all this is getting to the aim of free speech.
My question back to you once more is, even though these are very clear obstacles and difficulties and the collusion is, I think, apparent, did social media not help your rise, by the way? I mean, could you have achieved your success without social media? I mean, you have a large following there.
Look, Twitter in particular, I mean, I've met a lot of friends on Twitter. Twitter's been good to me. I mean, I'm not sure what to say about it. Look, many of my other friends have been treated not so well on Twitter, but most importantly, I think that Twitter has assumed the role in our current discourse of a vital, vital function that is analogous to the modern day public square. And this is the key point. This is the key point that if I want you to take away any lesson, here's what I would want you to take away. You know, back when America rebelled against the British back in the 1770s and 1780s, you know, we had this man named Thomas Paine who would run around the Philadelphia Commons with his pamphlet Common Sense, trying to stir up rebellious sentiment among the colonists. And, you know, that was the public square back then. It was these literal physical town commons. So something like the First Amendment would naturally apply to government property. What is the town square today? I mean, no one's going out in the streets of or the town square to literally pass out pamphlets. Our functional town square is social media. The problem is that under current law, our constitutional protections do not apply to private media. So that is the paradigm that we're trying to rethink here, and it is only exacerbated by this collusion between the public and the private sector that we have never seen before.
Eva, you're also very successful on social media. What's your take on this?
Well, I mean, I quite literally wouldn't be sitting here without Twitter, I think. Twitter has been a massively important platform for me. But even quite recently, a couple of months ago, I received, I think, arguably the shortest permanent ban in Twitter history from one day to the next. And mind you, this was already when Elon had purchased Twitter, so this was already under Elon's rule, so to say. I opened my Twitter account and suddenly found out that I was permanently banned without any warning, without any explanation given. And that showed me the vulnerability of that position. And thankfully, I also have made a lot of friends on Twitter. And with a Reinstate Eva campaign, thankfully, I was back within 4 hours, but I never officially heard what the reason for my suspension was. And like I said, that is a vulnerable and dangerous position to have, and we all have that in a way. If I lose my account, it's pretty much done for me. So even with Elon here now, and the EU still, already threatening to fine him on the basis of, again, this Digital Service Act. If you don't know it, look it up. It's horrible. A little peek into our future, I would say. Yeah, so I don't think we can put all of our hope or solace into one individual or one platform.
Fortunately, the left, who isn't sure what a woman is, also didn't know what permanent was. So we're okay.
True.
Right. So last question for all of you. Tim, I think you said that free speech is much like a wave, where we're in kind of a valley now, but there are still hills to come and better times ahead. What do you think the steps are? And I'm asking this to each of you. What are like 3 concrete steps that should be done immediately to help increase the free speech in the Western world? 3 steps.
I think for me, probably the most important is in the world of education. And that steps away from broadcasting or steps away from social media. But we just published a piece today in the Washington Times about the commencement speakers. It's graduation time. And if you go to colleges all over the United States, you will find politicians and bureaucrats from the left. You will find nearly no one from the right, because the educational system is set up to try to influence young adults. My son is in college now, but that goes back into primary school now. They have certain things that are allowed or not allowed. If you wore an Obama t-shirt, you were perfectly fine. If you wore a MAGA hat, M-A-G-A, Make America Great Again, they were afraid that would offend someone. Now, if you live in the United States of America, I'm not sure why you would be offended because you would like to make the country great again. But the rules were very different depending on what side of the spectrum you were on. And you now have arguments. It's controversial in the state of Florida because the governor and the state legislature has passed a rule that says they don't want to teach kindergarten, 5-year-olds, about lesbian, gay, transgender. That's controversial, that they're not going to have instruction on gay sex to kids that are 5 and 6 and 7 years old. So I think the number one thing is we're indoctrinating people so that by the time they're Ava's age, certainly by the time they're my age, then they're going to be so far down the road into being indoctrinated that they don't even realize what they've given up. So I think that's an essential element, is make sure we take back that educational element.
Eva?
Well, we have to understand that the battlefield is our mind. So we have to stop doing their work for them and not censor ourselves before they do it to us. So the one thing that I would say that we have to do in order to fight this is to keep saying the things that we know are true, but that we are afraid or nervous to say. If we already do the work for them by then shutting up and not saying what the truth is, then we've already lost. So just say those things that you're uncomfortable to say as long as you still can.
So, strongly agree with what my good friend Eva just said. Andrew Breitbart famously said, "Walk towards the fire, do not be afraid." So I think that very much encapsulates what Eva said, and I couldn't agree with that more. As far as kind of 3 concrete steps that I think we on the right could take, one would be, I mean, we haven't gotten, unfortunately, to talking about kind of alternative media, alternative social media. I think that is very, very important. We need donors, we need funders, people who are willing, people who are entrepreneurs, who are willing to start alternative media companies, who are willing to start kind of pro-free speech, pro-dissident speech social media companies. But at the same time, we cannot forsake kind of the vestigial kind of old school institutions. I mean, I work at Newsweek, which has been around for almost 100 years. That's a very old institution. I've managed to find a perch there, you know, and to the extent that we can kind of get obviously wealthy donors or people who have made a lot of money, who kind of more or less share our views, who can take over an institution that is important, then we should pursue that as well. Elon Musk taking over Twitter is a good example, although I don't think he's actually done a great job, but that's neither here nor there, conversation for another day. But in theory, that's a good example as to how that should work. And finally, then, you know, the various kind of policies, at least for the United States that I pointed out, I think could also kind of help restore free speech culture if successfully pursued.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eva, Tim, and Josh. Thank you very much for participating. Good talk. That's all, folks.